Yes, so I'm David Shreve. I'm the director of the Conservation Foundation, and that's celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And even before we were launched, I actually did a project involving elm trees which were thought to be disease resistant, and developed by Professor Eugene Smalley at the Wisconsin University. So they came from the States, and we've actually over the years planted quite a lot of them. And we are here opposite our office, and in a very historic site. We're looking out on what was the site of the Great Exhibition in 1851. The Crystal Palace was on this site, and within the Crystal Palace there were some elm trees. And we're here, there are still elms. The great message to get across to people in London and people who say, oh, elms have had it, they've all gone, is to say, no, they haven't. They are still around, and they're in Brighton, and they're in London, and they're all over the place. And Mark, who is with us, goes all over the place, including New York and Washington, looking at elm trees. So we are living proof to tell you that there are still elms around.
Yeah. So I'm Mark Seddon. The only reason I was travelling around is because I used to work for the United Nations, but I've been a journalist for most of my life, and I've written about the elm because I've had this early interest in elm trees, and actually it was sparked by the fact that my grandparents lived in Walsingham Road, Hove, and during the great drought of, I think it was 1976, when I was a youngster, there was a there was a young elm that was wilting in the pit, so we watered it, and that got me interested. And at the time, Dutch elm disease was sweeping right across the country, and Brighton Council was being very proactive in doing its best to preserve the elm in the city and also into East Sussex. And so I began to read some leaflets about Dutch elm disease, learning about the trees, learning how to identify the disease and to report it. But you know, as I met David, I met others, and I met Peter Bourne, all of these amazing people who know a great deal about the elm. And you know, I became more and more concerned actually that the work, especially in Brighton, was so important, because really it is the last place that there is such a diversity in Britain, which is why you've got this national elm collection. And it's also the last place really where you can find significant numbers of English elm, very large English elm, the most famous being, of course, internationally now, the remaining Preston Park twin, and is drinking to its recovery this year.
I still, meet people in Brighton, residents of Brighton, and they say, oh, we've still got elm trees. I thought they were lost in the 70s, and it's like, no, that's what this fantastic street tree outside your house is. And they're so surprised, they think that, well, what did you think it was? What was it? But it's an elm. And one of my favourite trees are the ones in East Street, which were planted, they were clones developed in 1963 and released for sale in 72, and obviously planted sometime after 1972, so they were planted in the 70s and they're still here now.
The elm is such a tough tree. It grows in the poorest soils. It'll tolerate so much salt. We get it really quite close to the beach. Some of our roads are very, very windy, very, very salty. And the old Stein itself, it's only just up from the beach. It's bathed in salt air, salt winds. It still supports elms, not much else. It's a really, really tough tree. It just has this Achilles heel that is elm disease. To identify the elm disease and to identify it early on is difficult to do. But I've learned a lot from my three predecessors at Brighton Borough. That would be Rob Greenland, who was our officer, John Harraway, who was the arboricultural assistant, and Ray Strong, who was the art manager, but particularly Ray Strong.
Because I was on the gang in the early days, I was also there at the time of the birth of the amorphous group Save the Elms campaign, which actually originated with as a direct action group with members of the then tree gang. There was a need. We realised from a very enlightened foreman on the tree gang, Ray Strong. He realised and he discussed with us as a gang that there was a growing need to do something locally. Otherwise, many elms would be lost.
And we waged a campaign that's against the beetle because it's the easiest way to try and stop the fungus. You can't physically stop the fungus, so you try and stop the beetle by removing those sites where the beetle will breed the elm logs, the infected tree.
And certainly there's been a lot of campaigns to protect the trees here, and they are loved by the locals, I know that. And trees have been saved and protected, thank goodness, in campaigns to save them, like at Seven Dials, with the alteration of a road junction.
Somebody sat at the top of a tree 3 days. You will not cut this tree down. And was fed by the locals. Very bright story.
Since I started, just over 2 years ago, I've had a lot of contact with Peter, especially during elm disease season. So he's an invaluable asset to the council and to my team. He dedicates a lot of his time to the Brighton elms, the Brighton and Hove elms, and has done for over 30 years. So certainly in my short time, he's been very active with identifying diseased trees, which is always extremely helpful, especially with somebody as knowledgeable as Peter. But also the amount of work he does in the background, essentially, promoting the National Elm Collection as far and as wide as he can, creating links or maintaining links with other people involved in the the propagation, the management, the upkeep of elm throughout the world, and to a larger extent as well the identification and classification of our elm stock.
We've always been grateful to Peter for a long time because he's plugged away at the elm identification side of things.
The minutiae, the attention to detail. There isn't a tree, and I'm not exaggerating, amongst our 17,000 elms that he cannot go to, look at the leaf, tell you the variety, tell you how old it is, tell you why it's special. I mean, no wonder people from Australia and New Zealand seek him out. His knowledge is profound. And I've learned to respect and like that. It's been amazing.
He was the sole individual, and still is, to identify elms with any degree of accuracy. We rely on him so much, and I'm sure we would have not put him for the elm collection status without Peter's help. He was key to that.
So how did we get the information together to actually say we have got the National Elm Collection?
Peter?
Yeah, I pulled loads of data up. There was a set of books that used to use nursery distribution booklets, and I just jotted down every elm entry. There was in these booklets. There was about 36 of them, and I don't know where they are now. They're probably put in storage somewhere. But they were they used to list every plant that used to go out the nursery, Brighton Stanmore Park, then send them out to the location, write down the location, and wrote down the year and the date and everything. So I jotted down this data, and then I followed up on where certain trees were, because we had to try and, it was a bit of a puzzle, because basically there's no data to identify anything. So a lot of the trees were, literally nothing on them at all. So you had to just literally go to the site and say that you knew there was 5 plantings of them, and then you go to the site and you see the 5 plantings, and then you'd match up with the next set that would follow the same suit. You'd say, like Holmes 148 would be in Crispin Way, and it would be at Stanmore Park, it would be in Wooding Dean. Then you go to the sites and then check up to see if they matched. If they matched, then you know that's 148. And that's how it went on, basically putting the puzzle together and breaking it all down.
What's extraordinary is that when I first talked to Brighton about this, which must have been about 18 months ago, I had no idea there were things called champion trees. And I'm not sure Brighton knew about champion trees. I now know a lot about champion trees, and we have many champion trees in the city. And by champion, they've been identified as notable trees for their age, their history, their rarity, their girth, their size, their height. And lo and behold, there are lots in the city. So we really are very lucky. And we deserve, and they deserve to be protected.
Yes.
In the summer months, we meet up regularly with Peter when he's out elm disease spotting to come up with a strategy, plot where the infections are found, so we can find if there's any sort of localization, which would then give us a good indication to where we might be looking for logs. And this has been very successful. We had one outbreak where we lost 13 street trees, which equated to about £35,000 worth of funds to deal with them, and we found it to be a log pile in a school. Looking over garden fences and here, I suddenly realised when I had binoculars looking through school gates that maybe that wasn't quite a good idea in this day and age. But we got there and we got our trees saved.
My favourite was, and this goes right back to the days when I was actually climbing trees, and pruning trees, is Ulmus sarniensis and the wheatley elm types. Sarnia was the old name for Jersey, the Roman name for Jersey, so it's often called the Jersey elm. It's like the big trees in Preston Park.
There's some very nice trees here that I've sort of known for many, many years. I think my favourite is that rather hidden tree in the Pavilion Gardens. It's the one that's got iron bands around it, and it's hollow, and it doesn't look much because it's close to the buildings. It's on the footpath, and it doesn't stand out. But that tree certainly predates the pavilion and all those buildings. So that was standing in a field before all this happened.
At one point I was doing like 16-hour days, and that's just interesting because I was on the dole, I wasn't doing anything, so I'd go around and study the elms and wrote down. I did this whole street survey of Brighton, because the funding's the biggest problem. You are looking at them, especially with Brighton Elm Collection, you're talking thousands. So, you've got to have the money to do it, and there's not many experts now to actually propagate old school elms, which we call old school elms, in the very old cultivars. But it needs to be done, because if we don't save them, it'd be like, like any rare plant or animal. Once it's gone, it's gone. You lose it. Brighton, there's probably a good 15 trees which are the very last of their type. And they're gone. That's it. So hence the reason, the desperation to try and get it propagated. So looking at the resistant elms as well, they cover all the fundamentals that that they need for a modern day tree. So those trees will take over eventually from the old school trees. But in the process of them taking over, we've got to look at the conservation of the old species. So if we don't do anything about the old species, then we'd lose them. And all the stuff that was done in London on the mapping system and everything else has inspired other people like Vivian to come along and say, well, can't surely do that for elms in Brighton, you know, something like that. And of course now Brighton's been notched up higher and higher and higher in the social media scale because of, you know, all these extra bits that I would say 20 or 30 years ago we'd never dream about, you know, never dream about putting things on, you know, on an electronic mapping system that everyone can look at the world and that sort of thing.
There is essentially a veteran English elm that we recently had to do some pretty severe tree works to due to a few defects on it, but it's an amazing tree. It is a veteran. It's huge in terms of its stem diameter, and it's got a lot of things going on with it, and a lot of bracket fungi around the base that we monitor. But I just think it's quite unique in where it's located on one of the busiest roads in the city. It's a great example of a long-living veteran elm, but in a not a usual scenario that you would see one right next to a busy road. But you know, we're committed to keeping it going and maintaining it and keeping it safe, but retaining it for as long as we can. The elm is incredibly resilient, you know, to the environment it sits within, soil types, pruning, decay. It really is an incredible genus of tree in terms of surviving in the urban environment.
Professionals have learned over the years that the most valuable trees aren't always the ones that look pretty and imposing. Often it can be a veteran that's been reduced over the years, is gnarled, has holes in it, has fungus on it. They can be as valuable and as interesting as any tree.
My favourite elm, because it's been left uncut, unpollarded, is the one adjacent to the pavilion on the north gate, and it's in the leaflet. And when that's in leaf, it just looks adorable. And somehow the proximity of the Brighton Museum Dome lends a sort of Brighton feel to it, so I love that.
Yeah, I've got this awful bias for the English elm. I love its character, and I hope that those native trees are still planted.
Can you just describe its character and the things that you like most about it?
Well, when it can, it produces a tall tree with a billowing crown, lovely texture to the bark, large lower stem, and the crown over time typically becomes rather uneven because they they have got a habit of losing large side limbs.
We're moving in the right direction, even just with the standard sort of breeding program to produce elms which are the right shape and form, elms which support certain key elements of our wildlife, like the white-letter hair streak butterfly. Many of these resistant elms all happily support the butterfly, so they're great. So plant more of them.
It's proved that we do have the resources and the knowledge to stop these outbreaks and keep our fantastic trees.
The truth is, it will remain under threat. But with the elm population that Brighton now has, I hope that they will continue to be a bit brave on occasions and still plant English elm, the native elm. Somebody's got to do it. I've got 2 elms in my garden, and one of them is a sport of a tree which came from Brighton. They're too valuable to lose, and as I say, it would be far too much of a risk if you put all your hopes on that type of elm, the native elm. But Brighton has spread its bets now. It's got all sorts of trees, elm trees. So I hope it will continue to be planted.
If we stop protecting, then we lose our beautiful, mature trees within the city. It would be absolutely devastating. The treescape would change forever.
If you mention, as I have done over the last 2 years, avenues or streets of elms to people you know, and they start to notice, because we just take them for granted, they are suddenly in awe of this extraordinary canopy of trees down the street, as in the drive, as in Shirley Drive, which you and I photographed, the level, Cardinal Hill, stunning, but people don't notice. So I'm hoping that will be put right.